Do you want to play a game? Hello and welcome. In this video, we'll be questioning whether Saw, the movie franchise, whether that would rehabilitate from a counsellor's perspective. Quick disclaimer, this video is satirical. I'm not promoting that we should stick our ex-offenders in reverse bear traps, but let's ask ourselves the question and discover whether the Saw traps would in any way rehabilitate people. If you are watching this in spooky season, then happy Halloween, and in the background of this video I'm playing some Binding of Isaac, the video game, because firstly I quite like it, and the footage of that game makes the video a bit more interesting than just the audio of me talking to the camera on a Zoom call. And secondly, it's a game about a baby collecting items that often disfigure them or are painful. So Isaac is becoming more powerful to stand up against their mum, and that sort of loosely parallels Saw having to suffer torture to overcome adversity, overcome our evil ways. Anyway, the Saw franchise. As a counsellor, I regularly see people finding sudden changes within therapy that adapts their personality for the better. And it got me wondering, would the philosophy of John Kramer, i.e. Jigsaw, and those Saw traps that he builds actually help a person to change their lives for the better? If you've not seen a Saw movie, thank you for clicking on the thumbnail. Saw, they're gory horror movies where a person is locked in a trap and they are forced to graphically mutilate themselves in order to survive. That person, they usually have a long criminal history, some kind of character deficiency, or they're immoral and unethical in their actions, the way they work. So, an example, in the film Spiral, there is a corrupt cop who repeatedly lies in the witness stand. And part of Kramer's philosophy isn't that the person's being punished, but rather they are tested or playing a game, usually with a very, very short time limit that people barely make it out before they are gruesomely killed. So in this game, the person, our cop, they're trapped and they must make a choice to mutilate the body parts which is contributing to their immoral dealings in order to escape. So in our example, this cop, they are hung by their tongue on the train track, and they need to rip off their tongue to escape in time for the coming train. And if they rip off their tongue, they escape. If they don't rip off their tongue, then they are keeping their lies. That's the philosophy of Kramer. And there are various survivors of these traps across the Saw films. In Saw 7, there's even groups, like a 12-step program for people who have survived and found some kind of purpose or transformation from these games. And then some of those survivors go on to want to replicate Kramer's techniques, becoming protagonists for the future movies. And fortunately, they kill the main character off by about the third film, and he just keeps coming back in flashbacks. So some people become future converts, but usually their old behaviour prevents them from fully adapting Kramer's philosophy without personal gain or vengeance of some kind. Let's talk a bit about personality change. Carl Rogers, he's the founder of the person-centered approach, and in 1957 he writes about therapeutic personality change. 1967, excuse me. He talks about moments of movement in therapy, and those moments spilling out of a connection between the therapist and the client, where the client feels fully received for every aspect of themselves and deeply and empathically understood. In my experience, sometimes these moments can be rapid and sudden for clients. And other times there are these really gradual aha moments that emerge over many sessions. Rogers typifies personality change from being in a a state that's quite rigid, based on the past, detached from our experience, and various contradictions within us, to in the place of flow, where we're in touch with our feelings, in touch with our experience, and individual meaning and ideas continually emerge and bubble up in a state of continual change. Rogers adds that as our personality changes within an environment of genuine acceptance and empathy, we become more understanding and accepting of others as unique individuals, just as we become more accepting of ourselves, which results in the building of community and a movement away from hate. Now, this accepting environment is obviously very different to the one that Kramer is proposing. Rather than the accepting and empathic understanding to change in Kramer's philosophy, we have to choose to violently remove a body part that we're misusing. So could this technique, could this new therapeutic intervention, so radically different to others, promote therapeutic change? Could it actually work? Could I chop off my hand and then find a new lease of life? And to answer that, I would like to firstly talk about AA, psychedelics, and sudden change. Bill Wilson was the co-founder of AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and he was infamously quite intrigued by the potential for using LSD for bringing about transformation in people who are stuck in the midst of their alcohol addiction. He saw the potential of LSD to create a spiritual awakening which could help the addicts look beyond their own lives to something that was more powerful for them. And if you look at the 12-step philosophy, those first 3 steps, they require a person to firstly recognise that they're not in control of their addiction, of their lives. But secondly, believe that there's some kind of power beyond them that can restore them to sanity, that can take them out of their addiction, to move them into sobriety, and then to give themselves over to that power. And Bill Wilson, he felt that LSD could do that, provide the Damascus Road experience of being so impacted by an experience that their lives are changed into believing in this higher power. Applied to those groups in Saw 7, the survivors talked about being impacted by the event and inspired to live their lives anew. So, though the physical and psychological traumas of what they went through has somehow inspired them, it happened, they've gone through it, but somehow they're more powerfully enabled to step out of their former lives in this violent spiritual awakening. It does then seem possible that these barbaric traps could be a turning point in the victim's life, in the same way that this psychedelic drug might provide a new perspective on our own lives. Some differences between those two things, though, are that the person hasn't chosen to be in a saw trap. They're very unlikely willing to step inside and have to mutilate themselves, whereas maybe with the psychedelics and Bill Wilson's idea, they might be voluntarily taking the LSD. And we can view the traumatic incidents as spiritual awakenings, sure, but we can just as likely find ourselves, rather than awakened, traumatized by it. In the case of LSD, Wilson's hope was seeing the potential for a higher power, whereas in Saw there is no higher power, or big book of the Kramer methods. There's just lopping off your limbs and realizing you'd rather live without it than continue immorally living on with it. Let's talk about rock bottom. Let's talk about those moments of change. In 2008, Groundwell UK published a research project called The Escape Plan for people who had been repetitively stuck in cycles of homelessness. And it researched what enabled people to move on from those homelessness cycles. They interviewed 25 people who had escaped homelessness, calling them escapees, and they found that there were 7 factors to help someone escaping. One of those was reaching rock bottom, an epiphany that 10 of the 25 escapees identified with. In reaching rock bottom, they realised that they couldn't continue the path they were on any longer. That change wasn't just desired, it was actually needed in their lives to live this more desirable future. One participant wrote, "So it's either you sort it out like you say you can, or you just piss off and die somewhere, because at the end of the day, it's either put up or shut up." Applied to SOAR, we need to realise a few things. Firstly, each escapee's rock bottom is individual to them. For one person, losing a leg to a DVT because they're injecting in it would be a very strong motivator to change. For another, they might end up having to lose the other leg, a relationship, a marriage, their home. Each SOAR trap, in the same way, is custom made for the individual, but with rock bottom, it's very subjective. There's no way of forcing that rock bottom experience. A person has to be in rock bottom themselves, rather than waking up in a bear trap and going, this is it, it can only go up from here. Secondly, the escapees talked about the importance of making a choice after realising their lives are out of control because of this rock bottom moment. Whereas in the SOAR traps, the victims seldom, if ever, have a strong sense of guilt that their actions have consequences afterwards. They seem more angry, understandable, for being locked up. The victims have also not chosen to be in those traps, nor is it a direct consequence of their behaviour. It's more indirect that they are caught up by Jigsaw. They haven't decided to change, rather they're being punished or tested, and that change is being forced on them. Finally, the escapees mentioned the need to be supported at that pivotal moment when they hit rock bottom. You need recovery workers for addictions, you need workers to help with housing, you need support. And that was pivotal, where there was that tiny moment of change. You need a lot of help to change. In SOAR, the victim is usually left mutilated and alone, or more likely dead, rather than supported by a programme to encourage reflection on change and the numerous practical and psychological steps we need to actually actualise that change. Let's talk a bit about violence. Let's talk about discipline as well. In SOAR 5, Jigsaw says, "You and I both know the statistics for repeat offenders in this city. 67.5% of criminals are back in prison within 3 years. And what he's saying is that a custodial sentence doesn't rehabilitate a person compared to the SOAR methods. But the UK statistics, the UK government statistics for 2021, put overall proven reoffending rates at 24.3%, much lower than the 67 odds that SOAR quoted in the SOAR universe. But it does open up that question of, does punishment actually work? There was a 2002 meta-analysis, that means a reading of lots of different articles on this subject, that looked at 442,000 offenders in Canada. And it looked at if punitive approaches to offending, such as incarceration or boot camps, actually worked. And what they actually found was that harsher punishments didn't reduce reoffending. In fact, punishments increased reoffending by 3%, especially if that was a long custodial sentence. What this is saying is that getting tough on crime to punish offenders, it doesn't work. And so why would these violent traps be any different? And on violence, a review in 2021 on 20 years of seeing the effects of smacking on children, beating them, found that rather than improving a child's behaviour, smacking actually makes it worse in the long term. Rather than violence teaching a child that they're doing wrong, they learn to accept violence and antisocial as part of normal. It just normalises violence. And rather than the safe, accepting, empathic environment I described that usually fosters personality change, violence as a mean of discipline, as a means of rehabilitation, it can destroy that sense of safety in the home and turn home into a fearful, dangerous place. In reviewing the research, Duran and Ensom highlighted how corporal punishment in children actually leads to aggression, antisocial behaviour, mental health issues, addiction, less cognitive development, and the punisher is likely to actually end up going too far and injuring the child. A significant number of people who smack injure. Applied to the Saw universe, there are people who take on and become like Saw's disciples, Amanda or Detective Hoffman. They experience this spiritual awakening from the Saw traps. They're converted and they end up putting other people in those traps. And could it be argued that just like a child subjected to punitive smacking punishments, that Hoffman and Amanda have been converted into subjecting the violence that they experienced onto others, whilst being desensitized to the torturous gore that they're inflicting? What is clear is that violence is not an evidence-based means of rehabilitation, and that any change is likely to be short-term or more motivated by fear than an internal personality change. Furthermore, punishment isn't an evidence-based method of rehabilitation. But it used to be. Let's talk about medieval torture. I actually tried to find some statistics on the efficacy of medieval torture. If anyone does find any, please comment. I would be fascinated to read it. So I was trying to find statistics on the efficacy of medieval torture or violence means of torture to rehabilitate offenders. Surprisingly, I could not find any. But what stood out for me in trying to look at these stats is that torture and corporal punishment aren't meant to rehabilitate. That's not the purpose of them. Rather, medieval torture was more often than not about extracting information, torture, or it's meant to warn other people of the consequences of breaking the law. You string people up in the gallows so everyone can see this is the consequence, rather than trying to teach the person who's in the stocks, for example. The problem of trying to scare people into behaving because of consequences, however, the problem of doing that is that when someone commits a crime, they're not thinking consequentially about the punishment. People that smoke, on the side of every cigarette packet you can see that it will cause you cancer, it will cause impotence, your teeth will fall out. Smoking's terrible for you. And yet we ignore the image on the side of it. We aren't mulling over the health impacts on our body. A lot of nurses, a lot of GPs will smoke because you don't have consequential thinking when we put that cigarette in our mouth. During my working week, I facilitate groups for people in recovery from addiction. And there's a powerful technique called the play the tape through to the end technique. We might be craving a drink, and there may be euphoric recall. We remember real pleasant drinking memories and completely forget the way our lives fell apart. And that euphoric recall can lead to a lapse. So rather than settling on the urge or craving, play the tape forward considers the full consequences of a relapse, the allergy-like reaction of not being able to stop drinking, having to lie to loved ones, committing crime to fund the habit, the impact on the health, the depressive feelings, the self-loathing, the not sleeping. Consequences are dire. And this is a powerful approach to helping somebody to change. It's a powerful rehabilitation technique. But this technique is taught to people that are abstinent, not to people who are in the midst of addiction. Violence and medieval torture aren't great deterrents for offenders, because the person offending is unlikely to consider the consequences of their actions during and immediately before the offence. It's more impulsive. What I'm arguing in relation to Saw is that knowing the jigsaw killer is active in a city is unlikely to have much of an effect on offending. That scaring a person into rehabilitation by torturing them doesn't suddenly give them consequential thinking of the future. The only effect I can imagine is that being maimed might physically make it harder to re-offend. Our lying cop, for example, can't stand up in the witness stands and lie so easily when he doesn't have a tongue and actually he died, so he definitely won't be re-offending. That's the most successful form of rehabilitation. Let's talk about post-traumatic growth. Trauma is a human response to a profoundly shocking incident or prolonged exposure to incidents that we struggle to process. Trauma stays with us intrusively both in our mind and in our body. And trauma responses to situation and what cause those responses can be very personal. An ambulance worker, for example, will encounter situations on a daily basis that will traumatize the family of a victim, but not them as the professional. Actually remember a personal incident. I did CPR on somebody who died 6 years back and was viscerally traumatized by it, had flashbacks and everything, went through some personal therapy, and it's nice to talk now about that and not feel triggered. But the police, they were laughing and joking, they were bantering, because for them it's just another day, whereas for me, by God, it was awful. Being in a saw trap is, let's say, fairly likely to constitute a traumatic incident for most folks. There's gore, there's pain, a loss of control, narrowly escaping from death. All of that is exceptionally likely to traumatize somebody. And Joseph and Murphy, they write about trauma as completely disorganizing the self-structure due to the threat of this new trauma-related information. How can we go about our day knowing that at any point we might be captured and put in a machine that forces us to pull out our own teeth? It's unimaginable. They say our understanding of self is shattered, that trauma memories haunt us intrusively, and there are such strong visceral feelings attached to it. They also write about how therapeutic conditions of acceptance and understanding can stimulate a person to grow in their own way, to not just process this trauma they've gone through, but actually to start experiencing post-traumatic growth, as that trauma information is integrated into the self-structure, and it goes from being something that is existentially and safety-wise a massive thing to actually making us a better person. Trauma is deeply disturbing, and as a counsellor it's a privilege to see people processing their traumas and gaining insights that can be protective and add meaning to their lives. We can grow from our trauma, we can process it, and we can even experience post-traumatic growth. We might, for example, reassess our life after a near miss or a bereavement, develop as people. But what I really want to spell out is that we don't endure traumatic events deliberately to grow. Nor could the post-traumatic growth be predicted in any way or guaranteed for trauma sufferers. So, in conclusion, a person might grow from trauma. I mean, that is a possibility. They might grow from trauma, but it's not guaranteed, and it would be unethical to try and push people to endure traumatic offence without being able to predict the consequences of it. So a person may grow from being in a saw trap specifically, But inflicting traumatic incidents on a person isn't a way to initiate growth. And even if there was some kind of personal growth, it'd be really difficult to predict. Let's talk about the kind of people that get stuck in those saw traps. In Carl Rogers' 19 Propositions, he says that we are all unique human beings, and if we could truly understand each other and our upbringings, then the way we behave would make complete sense as attempts to meet our needs. And sometimes those attempts to meet our needs can feel and seem to us, and definitely to outsiders, a little bizarre, can seem maladaptive, can seem antisocial. But if we can really listen to that behaviour as trying the best we can with what we have, it makes sense. And in making sense, change can be an option. No one wakes up one day and says, I'd like to become a heroin addict. Nobody looks at jobs and thinks, criminal, I'd like to be a criminal. That's not how life is. Instead, we need to recognise that mental health issues, traumas, abuse, unmet needs, undiagnosed neurodiversity. We need to recognise that minority groups, that a lack of education or work, that poverty, that neglect disproportionately affect people with an offending background or addiction issues. What I'm trying to say is the people that probably end up in saw traps, they're pretty vulnerable people. It's no wonder that punishment alone doesn't rehabilitate. People being punished in these traps have already been punished by life. Kramer's philosophy is that everyone gets a choice and a chance to escape their old lives, and there's a future for them. It just doesn't acknowledge the weight of their past and puts the blame on the individual to change, rather than a compassionate understanding of why their lives may be the way they are. Inflicting trauma on people through saw traps doesn't help them change, because the people in those traps, they're already traumatized, and it was that very trauma that drove them into those maladaptive, unethical decisions in the first place. The UK government, our rehabilitation ideas are quite different to other places, like Norway, and then there are other countries still who are much more punitive. Our 2021 prison strategy white paper set out some plans to actually try and reduce reoffending in the UK. And those plans were to make prisons clean from drugs, and to offer inmates, treatment for addiction, give them equal opportunities, help offenders to move towards employment, support them before they're discharged. And they also want to punish people if there are antisocial behaviours during their sentence. To me, the support around addiction and towards employment and meaningful uses of time feel like a good direction for us to aim. I don't agree with all of it, but I like the idea of trying to support our inmates. Norway has an approach to prison and rehabilitation where the emphasis is away from punishment and incarceration and more towards rehabilitation. Consequently, prisons in Norway have fairly good facilities, as well as access to work, training and counselling. Furthermore, the culture of the nation wants criminals to be rehabilitated and able to reintegrate and contribute back to society. There's not the same stigma. Contrary to punitive approaches to rehabilitation, giving those people who need rehabilitating opportunities and support, and a culture that is less stigmatizing, really helps people change for the best. And I'm jealous of Norway. So to conclude, John Kramer and his imperfect disciples in future movies recognise that rehabilitation is unique to the individual, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. So they build traps for people based on their offences, etc. However, unlike Norway or modern restorative approaches to justice, they decide that trapping people into a unique machine and forcing them to lop off parts of their body is the best motivator for change. In researching punishment, we've discovered that it doesn't work, and violence as a means of punishment only leads to more antisocial behaviour. The violent, gory punishments might traumatize a person, and in processing that they may grow, but we don't traumatize a person in order to grow. We learned that change could come suddenly from spiritual awakenings or from hitting rock bottom, but those things can't be forced on a person, and that having to pull off your fingers is unlikely to be that vehicle of spiritual awakening. Finally, we learned that the conditions that bring about change therapeutically are usually ones of empathy and value, acceptance of the individual. And when applied to a prison, can look like investing in the individuals, their support and their future. To conclude, Kramer wanted to do more for individuals to help them change in the way that he had realised change himself. But all he really managed was to cut off a few limbs and kill people who couldn't subject themselves to that torture within the time limit. He could ask people if they want to play a game and then wait for their consent maybe. He could, instead of violence, help people with their recovery or qualifications until they reach that aha moment themselves. He could arrange meetings between offenders and their victims, facilitating restorative justice. It's probably unsurprising. My conclusion is that Kramer's philosophy does not work and should not be taken up as a form of rehabilitation. Sorry, British governments. But this wasn't only obvious from the beginning. The films themselves demonstrate how his ideas don't work out in practice. And even the people who are supposedly rehabilitated aren't able to change. They end up relapsing onto those same dark, selfish habits. Although this video is satirical, is satirical, it was based off of an article I wrote in 2023. Could we learn something when people wrong us? Could we approach them with understanding? Could we realise when we punish those around us that it's unlikely to really change them for the better, and rather might just enhance the stuff that we're trying to stop them doing? I appreciate you watching this more satirical, funny video than usual. Happy Halloween to everyone watching it in this season. I am a counsellor in Oxford, England. If you want to get in touch with me, then I promise I will not try to punish you or force traumatic rock bottom experiences on you. Rather, I believe that change comes best when we are understood and supported. You can follow me on Facebook at Simon's Listening Counselling Services, on TikTok at Simon's Listening, and my website is www.simonslistening.co.uk, where you will find the write-up in full with all the links of where I got the studies from for this video, and I'll put a link in the description. Thank you for listening. Happy Halloween, and be careful when you lie, because some bloke in a pig mask might just hang you up in front of a train by your tongue and force you to cut it off.